Welcome back to the second half of Chapter 7. The picture you see is from Grand Island Daily Independent, and this is probably what Dan and Arthur were looking at. When we left off, the boys had just gotten out of the basement with the help of Stacy. Thank you, HarperCollins and Ivy Ruckman, for allowing us to do this read aloud with our students. Back to Chapter 7. This is the second half. Stacy handed me the torch so that she could snap her dad's denim jacket around Ryan. "Stacy, I have to find my mom," I blurted out suddenly. "What do you mean? Don't you know where she is? I thought you were home alone tending Ryan." I could feel the corners of my mouth pulling down, and I turned away, so Arthur had to tell her for me. And when he finished, he asked Stacy if we could just take Ryan to their house so the two of us could go look for Mom. "Arthur," she exclaimed, "we don't have a house anymore." His jaw dropped. "We don't?" All that was left was a few walls. The whole neighborhood looks like this. It was Arthur's turn to be speechless. I know how sick this sounds, but somehow hearing such bad news made me feel better. We were all in the same boat. We were all homeless. Slowly we began to pick our way towards the street. "Where's Mama now?" Arthur asked. Patrol cars were down at the end of the block right after the tornado, loading people up. We took the kids down there and I begged her to let me come back to Dan's to look for you. She said that if I found you, we should get out fast, any way we can. It's too dangerous to stay here. I stopped right in front of her. "I am not leaving without my mom." "Of course not, Dan. We'll find her. You'll see." By then, Stacy had her arm around me, giving me a squeeze that made me want to cry all over again. "I'll bet she's waiting out the storm at Smiley's right now." A blast of wind plastered my wet clothes against my body, triggering a bad case of the shakes. I prayed to God she was right. Once we got to the street, we took off running, or trying to run. Arthur and I were in front, and Stacy right behind, with Ryan in his little Levi pouch. There was no time to think about what we might find between our house and Smiley's. We just took off. Covering those 3 blocks was like reliving my worst nightmare. It must have taken us 20 minutes just to get to the corner of Sand Crane Drive and Fonda Way, a distance I had clocked at 1 minute 3 seconds on my bike and 2 minutes and 4 seconds running. Remember those dreams where you're frantically trying to get away from someone but you can't move? In mine, it's always these great big hulking linebackers in black jumpsuits who tackle me all at once. They won't let go of my legs, so I just keep dragging them along. I'm yelling and screaming the whole time, but nobody comes to save me. Finally, I wake up in sweat, just as they're about ready to bash my brains out. That night, rain-soaked and shaken by thunder that rolled across the skyline like kettle drums, I kept telling myself that this was only a nightmare. Pretty soon I'd wake up and I'd laugh because none of it was true. But I knew I was feeding myself a lie. The truth was just too terrible, that's all. Everything on Sand Crane Drive was destroyed, and getting to Mrs. Smiley's place fast was exactly like trying to escape in a bad dream. All the structures, houses, garages, fences, telephone poles, had all been leveled. The debris scattered helter-skelter, and the only building still standing was a line of apartments several blocks away that we could see when the lightning flashed. The trees on Sand Crane Drive were straight out of a nightmare, too. They looked as if some giant with big, meaty hands had stripped off all the main branches and snapped the rest. A few of the big trees had toppled clean over, and their shagging root systems silhouetted against the electric sky and made them look like the landscape from a monster movie. There was no sign of Mom anywhere, or her silver Chevy Citation. Cars and trucks had been tossed around like toys up and down Sand Crane Drive, but hers wasn't one of them. We went a long time without stopping, stumbling and ducking things that were blowing loose, and I fell a couple of times. We were so intent on sweeping both sides of the street with our lights that we sometimes crashed into each other in the dark. "Mom? Mom!" I tried calling at first, but the wind just shredded my words. She would never hear me over the howling, splitting storm. Once my heart leapt. I thought I saw her. I caught a figure in my light, someone thin wearing jeans and hanging on to the back door of a van. When a man and a boy appeared, I recognized Jason Miller from school. I knew that the lady wasn't my mom, but his. They shone their lights on us, and Jason's dad yelled, "Who is it?" We slowed down and answered back. "Have you seen my mom?" I shouted. They looked at each other and shook their heads. Closer now, we could see they were inspecting their Miller's plumbing van that had been slammed against a tree in their side yard. Jason's shirt tails were flapping, and he appeared stunned at the sight of us running by. Until Stacy got hit in the face with what we thought was a flying shingle, we had hardly stopped at all. But then we had to. We made her sit down on the curb so that Arthur could inspect the welt that was rising up on her cheek. But Stacy only pushed him away. "I'm okay, you guys, really," she insisted, though she was blinking hard and I knew she was hurting. "Well, I can take Ryan," I offered as I gulped in the air. "Do you want me to?" "No, he's fine." Stacy hooked her hair behind her ears. She sniffled a little and then awkwardly got back up onto her feet. She hitched the baby back up into place again. "Look, Dan," she pulled me over. "Just look at him." I shone the light so that I could see Ryan peeking out from inside her dad's jacket. He looked up at me so bright-eyed and solemn that I had to smile. "Isn't he something?" Stacy said with a grin. "I think he likes the ride." And then we were off again. When Arthur yelled a little bit later, "A person could get lost," I knew what he meant. Without the familiar landmarks, we had long since lost track of who lived where. At last we reached the corner of Fonda Way and Sand Crane, only to find the intersection there was strewn with the litter of Aunt Goldie's house. All she had left was the bottom half of her yellow split level, and not even that. Part of the lower level had been sheared off too. Maybe Goldie had lucked out not being home when it happened. But I had to remind myself that none of us had lucked out. Not that night. My heart was pounding hard as I leapt over the splintered wood covering Aunt Goldie's front yard. I had stopped being careful by then, and I was yelling for Mom once more. I couldn't get the picture out of my mind of her flying through the air. She could be buried anywhere. How would we know? Arthur trailed me, both of us leaving Stacy behind. And then I saw Mom's car and my heart quit beating altogether. It was next door to Goldie's in Miss Stevenson's yard. It was a battered wreck wrapped up in a length of chain link fence. "Mom!" I screamed, climbing over everything to get to it. My hands shook wildly as I shone the light inside over the back seat and across the floor. It was empty. Her purse laid on the front seat and it was covered with broken glass. "Mom! Mom!" I cried, but the wind whipped the words out of my mouth. Frantically, I started hauling stuff out from underneath the car, boards and bricks and chunks of siding, throwing them anywhere, digging and crying until I couldn't see. I had to find her. She could be trapped or dying. Arthur grabbed my arm from behind. "Come on, Dan," he yelled. "She made it into Smiley's. I know she did." I shook him off. I had to find her. And then the two of them got a hold of me and they pulled me away from the car. I kicked at Stacy and I swore at Arthur, but they wouldn't let me go. Arthur wrestled the light out of my hands and he dragged me along beside him. I knew she was there. She was buried under the car. I just knew it. I didn't want to go on to Mrs. Smiley's and waste all that time, but they wouldn't let me go. I was so crazy right then that I didn't even see the person in the red windbreaker who was running towards us. "Look!" Stacy and Arthur shouted together. My mom's voice was screaming, "Danny!" Seconds later, I was in my mom's arms, crying like a baby. Arthur and Stacy were crying too, but Mom and I were the ones making most of the noise. You can't imagine how I felt right then. We all had our arms around each other. Mom was kissing everybody, including Ryan, right through the denim jacket. I figured then that nothing else mattered. You can do without all kinds of things. Your house, your bike, your room, a whole city of people. if you have the ones you love. Stacy and Arthur got in each other's way, trying to explain what it was like over at our place and at the Darlingtons and all over Grand Island for as far as we knew. We sniffed and wiped our faces on our sleeves, even Mom, then smiling through her tears and hugging us some more. It really was something. Suddenly Mom noticed how wet I was and she tried to give me her windbreaker, but I wouldn't take it. I told her I was used to it, which wasn't anywhere near the truth. Right away then she had to have Ryan, so Stacy gave him up and Mom started crying again. Once she had him in her arms, saying how thankful she was that we were all alive. "What about Smiley?" Arthur asked. "Oh, poor Smiley," Mom said in a rush. "She's trapped downstairs in her house. I don't know how we're going to get her out." We huddled there as she told us all about it, the rain running down on our faces and into our mouths, all of us shaking. She had taken Mrs. Smiley down to the basement and was on her way back to the car where she had parked it at Aunt Goldie's, having looked for her sister first, when she actually saw the tornado coming. She ran back into Smiley's, the funnel practically at her heels. She told us how she had to dive underneath the dining room table and she held onto the legs as the storm raged on and on. I knew when the roof ripped off. I felt Mom shudder, but I didn't know until later that the back porch was gone. It collapsed on top of the stairs. When it was over, I called, but I couldn't get Belle to answer. I thought she was going to cry all over again. I'm so worried about her. She could have a heart attack down there, and who would know? It was pitch black, and I couldn't get to her, so I started for home. But without a light, I had to go back. I began jumping up and down to warm up. My biggest worry right then was hypothermia. I was shaking so hard I couldn't stop. "Well, how can we leave Smiley?" Arthur began. "Maybe with the flashlights." Stacy had gone out onto the curb and she was motioning and pointing. "Mrs. Hatch, couldn't we get some help down there? That's where we took the kids right after." Once in the street again, we could see the lights and the figures moving around, a block or so beyond the Darlingtons' place. There was a bus and yellow lights flashing, and what looked like maybe a fire truck, and other headlights lighting up the intersection. "Oh, thank God," my mom said. "Danny, I died 1,000 deaths." She didn't need to tell me. We put on our arms around each other again. To think I almost left Ryan asleep in his room. I would never tell her that. I reached across Mom and I patted the little warm rump that was underneath the towel. Ryan Oliver. Saying his name almost choked me up. I was going to make sure that I would be the best brother who ever lived. That's what I was going to do. By the time we got down to the pickup corner past the sad hulk of the Darlingtons' house, an ambulance and a patrol car had arrived. The school bus was waiting to take people to Kmart, or so we were told. An emergency center had been set up there. With sirens going and red lights pulsing, the area reminded me of a disaster scene from TV for sure. The figures darting back and forth in the headlights turned out to be policemen, firemen, Arthur's neighbors, and a man that got on a bullhorn was asking people to come out of their basements. Search and rescue was beginning, he said, and he ticked off all the dangers of staying, and there were plenty. When he finished, Mom and Stacy tried to tell him about Mrs. Smiley, but it wasn't easy because everyone else was pressing in for help.